And our two guests this morning are John Mills, who's the founder of Labour Leave and the chairman of JML and the largest donor to the Labour Party. We're also joined by Jennifer Powers, who's an associate of the Competare trading consultancy firm and is a trade expert. Now, this morning we've just heard that the Prime Minister has decided to defer the vote on the withdrawal agreement. Can I just get your reactions to that first of all, John?
Well, I think it's burning up time, which is very, very scarce. I understand that we're not now going to have a vote until probably somewhere around the middle of January, and that seems a long way through that 100 days we've got till we get to the end of March.
Jennifer, is this just the Prime Minister clinging on to power?
Well, we will see. I do agree with John. It's disappointing because I think that should the withdrawal agreement be put to Parliament, it would be voted down, and that would give us the opportunity to change track and to abandon the withdrawal agreement as it currently stands and get something much better for the country.
Certainly interesting times. Now, today we're here to discuss trade, and I'd like to begin, if I can, by asking you, Jennifer, the withdrawal agreement that we now know has been deferred. What's the impact of that withdrawal agreement on Britain's potential future trade policy?
Well, it's catastrophic for it, and that's because in order to have a meaningful trade policy, one has to have an independent trade and regulatory policy, and the withdrawal agreement it stops us having those things. So it's really crucial that we understand the full impact that this withdrawal agreement has on our ability to do meaningful trade deals. And I use the word meaningful specifically because the Prime Minister does talk about how theoretically one could still do trade deals, but in practice this isn't the case, because if you can't set your own tariff schedules and if you don't set your own domestic regulation, both of which are ruled out by the withdrawal agreement and the backstop, then you do not have anything meaningful to discuss with potential trade partners. So in practice, those deals aren't possible.
So John, the backstop is a major bone of contention in the withdrawal agreement. We understand this is the major issue within Parliament. I mean, what alternative is there if we don't have this backstop? How can we, get rid of it and at the same time continue with an ambitious trade policy?
Well, I think I agree with Jennifer. You're in real trouble about having a real effective trade policy if you do have arrangements which keep us in the single market and the customs union, which is the effect of having the backstop in place, unless you get agreement from the European Union on a trade deal, which is not likely to be favourable to us at all. And this is the leverage that the backstop gives that really is the real problem for us. In terms of what's going to happen on the backstop, I mean, it does seem to me that all the experts agree that it ought to be possible to get a kind of max-fac technology-based system in place that should deal with the border, so you have no physical border there, but you deal all the trade that goes to and fro, either by exempting small traders or by having a trusted trader for the larger people who are involved. You may have a little bit of smuggling at the end of the day, but in the big scheme of things that's not so important. Now, even if the technology isn't readily available now, I think to have a backstop and say in 2 years or 3 years or some reasonable period of time, it's got to be ready, and the EU has got to accept that that will come into play with the best technology there is at that time, even if it's not absolutely perfect. That's something along those sort of lines which gets a termination date on that backstop would satisfy, I think, most people in the House of Commons. But I think that unless something is done about that backstop, we're never going to get a deal through the House of Commons that's going to be acceptable.
No, I think you're quite right. And in terms of the backstop, I mean, we want to ensure there is as frictionless as possible trade between Northern Ireland and the Republic, the United Kingdom and the European Union. Yeah. I mean, one of the things we're told is that there's going to be queues of lorries up the M20, people not being able to sell across the border in Northern Ireland. I mean, no deal. What is no deal? We hear a lot about it, but what does it actually mean?
Well, I think no deal is something that has caught the public imagination as a bit of a scare story. But in reality, most of the world is not in the European Union, and yet trade continues. And if you look at some of our biggest trading partners, like Australia, New Zealand, the United States, they trade with the UK and with the EU under WTO terms. So there's no such thing as no deal. There is the spectre of us having a facilitated exit, a managed exit from the European Union, where we would then trade on WTO terms. And there's 100 days until we leave the EU, and there is sufficient time, if minds are put to it, to put the necessary procedures in place to ensure that there are no blockades, that there are no huge delays or impact on consumers or business. So I think we just have to be really cognizant of the fact that all of these things are solvable.
John, your own company trades all over the world, most of it probably outside the European Union. I mean, you operate on WTO terms.
Yes, we do.
Are there really these major problems that afflict companies that we're being told?
Well, I think there's a short-term and a longer-term issue here. The short-term issue is, are we going to have lorry parks all over the place and long delays? I think it very much turns on how sensible people are faced with the problems that they're going to be at the end of March. The customs authorities already said that they'll give priority to getting traffic through rather than having more and more detailed inspections, and that seems to me the sensible sort of thing to have in place. The authorities in Calais and northern France, let alone other ports, have all said that they want to be as cooperative as possible because they don't want to lose business, they don't want to have chaos on their shores. So I think there's a pretty reasonable chance that come the end of March, in the short term, there won't be much in the way of delays and backups that people are frightened of. In the longer term, the issue is trade going to diminish significantly between the UK and Europe because we're in a situation where we have not free access, which we had at the moment, but a free trade deal. Now, free trade does involve slightly more complicated paperwork. You've got to have certificates of origin and so forth. But I know from experience, especially if you're dealing with large loads, container loads or full lorry loads, the difference in cost between the two and the additional complication is really minimal. And I think with a bit of extra manpower in place, which you could easily get in there given a relatively short period of time, and some flexibility during the early stages when you may be short of manpower, you could make this work.
I mean, we are told, aren't we, that, if we go out onto WTO terms, the costs on business in this country are going to be enormous, GDP is going to collapse. I mean, the reality is it's not the case. I mean, there are borders all around the world and trade continues. It
does, and even with the backstop, I think John's quite right to say that that's not the only option. If that was the only option that could be found for a temporary solution, then logic would follow it's the only possibility ever. And we know that can't be true. And so I think it's important to replace the backstop with something that works for the country. And I think, as John said, one can use existing customs facilitations that are in use all around the world. And it's not any sort of magic technology that hasn't yet been invented. These are things that are happening in borders all over the world every day, and they can be applied to the Northern Irish border, and all sides have already said publicly that they won't put a hard border there. So right. I think it's not a technical problem, and it's not a customs problem, it's only a political problem. And that can be solved if people put their minds to it. I mean, the EU and the Irish have negotiated incredibly well, and if we were looking at this objectively, we would compliment them for their negotiating skills. The UK hasn't played its hand as well. But I do believe there can be a standalone chapter, customs chapter with an Irish border protocol, which will solve the issue of the backstop, and we can make other changes to the withdrawal agreement, like taking out any reference to a customs territory, which would prejudice our ability to negotiate a meaningful free trade agreement in future, and that this alternative withdrawal agreement could command the support of the House. So I think whilst it's important to talk about the reality of no deal, because we need that as leverage in the negotiations. You know, it's incredibly important that in any negotiation that you're able to walk away.
Yeah.
That's your strongest card. And I think in this country we need to get a lot better at negotiating. I mean, this really is the basics of negotiation. You have to be able to walk away. So it's incredibly important that we continue with our planning for exiting on WTO terms. I don't think if it happened, it would cause the chaos that you reference others having maintained. I think you know, the civil service would have 3 months to put the necessary steps in place, and I think that would be fine. But I think in the meantime, there is this opportunity to actually go back to the EU and negotiate a better deal for this country with what we need. And I think the solutions are there. We just need the political will on our side to make it happen.
Now, one of the things you touched on, Jennifer, was that, you know, at the beginning of this, we said that reality is under this withdrawal agreement, we won't be able to sign our own trade deals. Now, the Labour Party, John, is saying that it wants to stay in a permanent customs arrangement with the European Union. I mean, that would just scupper our ability to have any trade deals on our own, wouldn't it?
Well, I think there is a major problem there, and I think really the choice the country has to face is whether it's going to tie itself to the European Union, which is an area of the world which is growing very slowly economically. I mean, what's happened in the last 20 odd years is that the proportion of GDP, world GDP and trade that we have with the European Union has fallen really very substantially, from nearly 60% to barely 40%, whereas our expected trade with the rest of the world has gone up the other way, as it were, from 40% to 60%. Now, if we can't do free trade deals, we will compromise our capacity for trading with the parts of the world which are growing most rapidly. And then, if the price for doing that is to tie ourselves more and more securely into the European Union, that doesn't look like a very good deal to me.
No, I mean, Jennifer, wouldn't the policy of having a permanent customs arrangement with the European Union essentially mean it doesn't matter who's in government in this country, our trade policy is determined in Brussels?
Well, that's right, and it is something that everyone in the Labour Party should care about, because actually, if you're in the customs union, as you say, you can't do trade policy because you don't have control of your tariff schedule and the associated regulations, which are your two levers of trade policy. And trade policy matters because, as John pointed out, the rest of the world is growing. So we want to be able to grow so we can have raising living standards and raising wages and share in the proceeds of prosperity. But also there's the ability to do good around the world. I mean, the third world, the developing world, is hugely disadvantaged by the current trade deals that the EU has with the Common Agricultural Policy, for instance. There's a huge opportunity for the Labour Party to lead on a more ethical trade policy around the world, should they wish. And secondly, I really want to bring on the fact that much of the Labour Party manifesto can't be implemented if the country stays in a customs union. I mean, I think this is something that is sometimes lost in the discussion. If a future Labour government wants to treat state aid in a very different way, that is precluded under a customs union and under the current withdrawal agreement. It's precluded under a Norway-style agreement. There are many other things around environmental standards, human rights, welfare, labour standards, which could not be introduced if the UK stays in close alignment with the EU, with continuation of the single market and the customs union. So this is something I think the Labour Party needs to think about. Do they want their manifesto? Do they want to be able to implement the last manifesto and build on that? Or do they want to stay close to the EU, for political reasons, but not be able to implement a lot of those manifesto commitments? And that's not a question for me, that's simply a judgment that the Labour Party is going to need to take.
I mean, one of the big battles that took place previously was the TTIP arrangement, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. Many people in this country, particularly on the left, were concerned about the consequences of that on our health service. I mean, if in the future we stayed in a customs union with the European Union and they were to embark on a similar treaty, a Labour government would be in a position where it could do nothing about it. And if wholesale sectors of areas of our public sector were being handed over, I mean, we'd have our hands tied.
Yeah, it's an interesting one because I think there's an assumption by some people on the left that the EU is always going to become more integrationist, and there'll be greater amounts of GDP spent on redistribution and so on. But it's equally true that some of the things the EU does are things that members of the Labour Party might not like. And if you're in the customs union and if you're in the single market, which would happen if the backstop came in on a permanent basis, because that really is a backdoor to a permanent membership of the customs union and the single market, because no UK government would be willing to diverge from Northern Ireland, because that would be putting our own border in the Irish Sea. So it's a very, very clever deal that has been negotiated by the EU to make sure that GB doesn't diverge from the EU. So it's sort of EU by the back door. So I do think that the Labour Party needs to think very carefully about what sort of future it wants, and if it wants to have control over its trade policy and its domestic regulation, then perhaps its future is outside of the withdrawal agreement and is outside of the single market and the customs union.
John, Jennifer's outlined some of the problems that the Labour policy has. I mean, what should Labour do? What should Labour's direction of travel be on a customs arrangement, on the single market, and on the general withdrawal process itself?
Well, the Labour Leave stance on all this has been that with all the difficulties there are, the free trade agreement along the Canada plus line proposal is really much the best solution. And I think that's so for a number of different reasons. First of all, I think it gives a result which is closest to the outcome of the referendum that took place in June 2016. Mm-hmm. Secondly, this is something which the EU is prepared to contemplate. In fact, it's been offered to us several times. It was offered by Donald Tusk to us in March this year. It was offered more recently by Michel Barnier. So you're not pushing against an open door there. You're not, against a closed door. You're not trying to do what I think has been the bugbear of all the negotiations we've got, which is nominally to come out of the European Union, but say, oh, we still want the advantages of being inside the customs union and the single market, at least to some degree. With the free trade agreement, we'd be outside both, but if we had a free trade deal put in place pretty rapidly, then what we could do is to have nearly frictionless trade with Europe on the basis pretty close to where we are at the moment, which would overcome a lot of those problems. Now, one issue that has been raised is whether we would be able to go straight to having tariff-free trade with the European Union before a full free trade deal was in place. And apparently the terms of the World Trade Organization rules are that we would be able to do this. If it was a step towards a free trade deal which would be implemented later on, we could have free trade with the European Union from the 29th of March onwards. And that seems to me to be a solution to the problem which would provide stability not only in the short term, but also in the long term. So I think one of the huge problems we've got is that the outcome of the negotiations we've got with the EU, with the withdrawal agreement, are going to lead just to unending internal division in this country between Eurosceptics and Europhiles, an unending acrimony between the sections of political parties here, enormous amount of energy focused on our relations with Europe at the expense of everything else. And it does seem to me one of the most important things we need to do is to move away from this, to have some sort of settlement which is going to last. And I do think the free trade deal approach is much the most likely to fulfill that criterion.
Now, on those trade deals, I mean, the European Union does currently have trade deals with other countries around the world. On March 29th next year, when we leave, will those deals still apply to the United Kingdom, or could we very quickly get them established as a deal between the United Kingdom and those countries?
Well, the problem at the moment with the withdrawal agreement is we get the worst of all worlds, which is that we would not get the benefit of these free trade deals, but the people of the EU would get the benefit in terms of being able to offer access to our markets.
Right.
So we
become a pawn.
We've been the worst of all worlds there, whereas again with a free trade deal we'd be in charge of our own trade policy. We'd be in a position both to negotiate free trade deals with new people and to have one with the European Union. And I must say, I would have thought that was a pretty bright future for the UK.
Jennifer?
Yeah, I completely agree with John. I mean, there is a real opportunity to do trade deals around the world. During the transition period, we are able to have talks, we're able to negotiate, but we can't sign anything until we're all the way out. But it's amazing what support there's been already. So Japan has said publicly that they want Britain to join the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Agreement, the CPTPP. And that is something that the UK government could choose to do or not. The US wants to do a trade deal, and they've said that very publicly. The really interesting thing about the UK and the US is that there isn't a trade deficit. And also the regulatory systems are fairly similar. So there's no opportunity, there's no concern on one side about exploitation or jobs leaving. So it's one of those rare cases where doing a deal is possible. And Australia and New Zealand also very much want a trade deal, and of course the EU wants a trade deal. So to John's point, two of the fastest growing parts of the world are Asia and North America. They want trade deals. The EU wants a trade deal. So the future is very bright. I think there's also a misconception about trade deals that I just want to put on the record. Oftentimes when people are dismissing free trade agreements, they say things like, well, we don't want to do a free trade agreement with the US because we don't want to take their chickens. And I think what one has to understand is trade deals, when and if we're allowed to do them, and I very much hope we are, they are negotiated with the country across the table. So you go through line by line, sector by sector, regulation by regulation, and you agree what is going to be permissible, what's in, what's out. That's how negotiation works, and it's very detailed and it takes hundreds of hours. For instance, the UK is predominantly a service-based economy. The US market is surprisingly closed on services. You know, there's a lot more on banking, financial services, insurance, accountancy, legal profession that we could be selling to the Americans. Massive market. Those markets are fairly closed. Now, the US could be persuaded to open those up. And in return, they would want access to some agriculture and some goods. Now, we don't have to give them any of that. We can walk away full scale, or we can agree to just those parts of the free trade deal that we think are in our best interest. And, you know, who's ever in power, whether it's Labour, Conservatives, or some other unfathomable coalition of parties, future or present, it will be up to that legitimate, democratically elected government to decide what trade deals to enter into and what to agree within those trade deals. So I think there's a real danger that people conflate future trade deals and what they're going to look like with the current discussion, which is simply, let's not tie our hands. Let's make sure that future governments of this country can decide to enter into trade deals. Let's make sure that future governments can implement their manifestos on which they're elected. Let's give the opportunity of this country to vote for what it wants. And people on the right can make their arguments for what kind of future they want. People on the left can do the same. And you know, that's, I think, what's at stake here is the ability of the UK to set its own course, both on trade, on domestic regulation, on the economy as a whole, and also those things that we touched on earlier around environment standards, animal welfare, labor, human rights. These things will all be within our control if and when we leave the single market and the customs union. So I think it's just a fantastic moment of opportunity for the country.
Jennifer, in terms of trade deals, does proximity matter? I mean, one of the things we're told is Europe's on our doorstep, it's our biggest market. I mean, in the modern world of today, does proximity between countries matter when you're negotiating trade deals?
Well, I don't think when you're negotiating, no. I think that there's a whole host of reasons that countries want to enter into trade deals with you. First and foremost, they feel it's in their national interest. They hope that it's going to grow their economy, as you hope it's going to grow yours. And as we've seen already from the countries that have said very publicly that they want trade deals with us, these are not next door. I mean, we've got Australia, New Zealand, Japan, the United States, India. It would be a more complicated deal to do, but India is interested in doing a deal. We could do a deal with South Africa. You know, there are opportunities out there. South Korea. I think that also you need to bear in mind that there are geopolitical reasons why countries want to do trade deals. So there's lots of motivations for them to agree to things. And that could be because of what's going on in their part of the world, and it could be about what's going on domestically. But there's lots of opportunities to really strengthen our ties internationally on a bilateral and multilateral basis. So again, I think it's a real opportunity for the UK to grow its soft power and actually spread its values, whatever those values may be.
Now, we've spoken a little bit about some of the opportunities of trade outside the European Union if we have our own trade policy. I mean, at the moment, our ability to trade with the developing world is very much restricted because we're still in a customs union with the European Union. Once we're out and that customs union is gone, how will trade with, say, the old Commonwealth and developing nations be far better than it is at present?
Well, at the moment, there's very substantial tariffs that the European Union levies on a lot of food products, on apparel, on shoes, which impact more heavily on working people and poorer people than they do on those who are better off. So there's a lot of welfare gains that could be made by reducing tariffs, but it's not just for the British consumer that these benefits would ensue. One of the problems about the European Union is that it's very protectionist against large numbers of developing countries, and won't allow them to sell their produce to the UK, their food, their manufacturers and so on. And trade is really more important than aid in many respects in terms of pulling these standards of living up in these countries. And the existing setup is really doesn't do this. I'll just make a couple of other points about negotiating free trade deals. One is that because we've got complete alignment with the European Union at the moment, negotiating a free trade deal with the EU is not going to be a completely simple matter by any manner of means, but it's going to be much easier than if we didn't have full alignment in the first place. The second is that actually the EU itself has not got a good record of negotiating trade deals, and the main reason for this is that if you've got 27 or 28 countries in a bloc, all of who've got some special interest, the French with films and all this kind of thing, it becomes much more difficult to negotiate free trade deals. And the argument that you need a huge bloc to be able to do that really doesn't stand up to investigation when you look at what's actually happened. I mean, the EU hasn't got a trade deal with India, it hasn't got one with Australia, it hasn't got one with the United States, it's just negotiating one with Japan, but it's still at fairly early stages. Whereas a little country like Chile has got far, far more free trade deals, and even Switzerland has got more than the EU has. So the idea that you need a huge trading bloc to be able to negotiate free trade deals with other people really doesn't stack up.
I agree, and to build on that point, I think what interests a lot of the world is the fact that we can be very much the proponent of this whole approach, this very international approach, and that we could have a deal with the EU on one side, we could have a deal with the US, and then we could have a deal with Asia. And so putting us very much at the center of this web of trade deals where we're able to promote trade as aid, where we're able to really have a larger role in terms of what's happening on the global stage. And I want to pick up on your point about the developing world, because a lot of the policies that the EU has in place, they have a incredibly severe impact on the various poorest countries of the world, because they are not able to grow as much as they might like, because then they fall out of the rules that the EU has set.
The classic one is coffee production.
Right.
Everyone cites, I think, is the common one. Yeah.
Indeed, and so there's a disincentive for them to actually raise out of poverty and to grow their economy. So it's a disincentive for them, and I think the social justice reasons for leaving the customs union and ripping up those very punitive measures is really strong.
Just want to touch on the point you made on size and scale. I mean, one of the things we're told is in any trade arrangement, if Britain were to go into embarking on a trade deal with China or the United States or India, one of the disadvantages we have is we are a country of 60 million consumers versus 1 point something billion in China, nearly 1 billion in India, hundreds of millions in the US. And they tell us, oh, we'll be at an automatic disadvantage, because why would the US or China or India offer us a great deal when they've got a market of 500 million in the European Union? Do you have any comments on that?
Well, I think the main reason is because if you've only got one country with one government, you're much more likely to be able to strike a deal than if you're trying to keep 28 governments and the European Parliament and Wallonia and goodness knows who else in line at the same time. So if you look at the history of what actually happens, although the EU has got much more clout because it's bigger, it's got a poorer record of actually succeeding in negotiating deals just because of the complications of trying to keep a whole lot of disparate countries all happy. And this is why, really, I think we've got a better opportunity for getting free trade deals all over the place if we negotiate on our own than through the EU.
Okay. I would agree with that, and I also think it's worth bearing in mind that whilst it's difficult to estimate the wealth that a particular trade deal will do, especially before you know the nature of that deal, we do know that when the OECD and others have modelled the economic gains from trade deals over a period of, say, 10 to 15 years, generally comes out at about 5 to 7% extra GDP growth for the totality of that system. So I think you have to be careful not to look at it just as one country. You're actually looking at that growth spread across the two countries that are doing the deal, and potentially you're locking into a much larger system of free trade agreements across the world. So, for instance, as I said a moment ago, if the UK is at the centre and has a trade deal with the EU and the US and many countries in the Pacific and elsewhere, suddenly you're looking at the extra levels of growth across that whole swathe, and that adds up to rising wages and rising living standards for a heck of a lot of people.
John, can I just quickly ask you what the problem is with the Norway model? Because that's being pushed at the moment by some in Parliament. What are the problems with a Norway-style deal with the European Union if applied to the UK?
Well, there are a number of different problems. One is just the legal side of all this, whether we're going to join EFTA, whether we're going to just stay in the EEA. There are rules of access about all this, and it's not at all easy to see a way through all this, which is going to be certainly one that can be put into practice quickly. Apart from anything else, the EEA option involves the agreement of a lot of other people, which may or may not be forthcoming. That includes the European Union and the other existing EEA members, who've expressed some doubts about whether they really want us in. So I mean, there's all those sorts of difficulties. But even aside of all that, it really doesn't solve the major problems that the referendum was all about. We still have free movement. We're still in a minority situation of being rule takers rather than rule makers. We've still got to pay large amounts of money into the budget all the time. We're precluded from doing free trade deals with anybody else. I mean, these are really major disadvantages. Now, there has been talk about saying, well, we'll just go in there for a temporary period and then come out again. But first of all, it's worth saying that Norway's been in a temporary period for, I think, 44 years now. So, once you're in, it's really, really tough getting out. Yeah. And so the negotiating difficulties around that are likely to be very, very substantial. And the idea, just to finish up, I mean, that within my lifetime, Britain was responsible to some degree to a quarter of the world's surface in the Commonwealth and the colonial system we had at the time. Okay, it's all gone now, but that's where we were. I mean, for the fifth largest or sixth largest economy in the world to be in a situation where large swathes of our commercial and economic and social legislation is laid down by another organisation over which we've got no control and which won't necessarily have our interests in heart is an extraordinary aberration away from what one would normally expect, and I think would be very unstable in the long term. I think we might find ourselves trapped in an environment where there was huge disagreement about the advantages but with no easy way out, and that seems to be a very poor way ahead.
Jennifer, just to wrap this session up, trade policy going ahead, let's just assume the withdrawal bill is defeated and we are in a position where we can determine our own trade policy. I mean, what should Britain's future trade policy be? What should it look like? How's it going to benefit the British people?
Absolutely. Well, listen, I want to say that I think voting down the withdrawal agreement when Parliament gets the chance.
If and when.
It's not a vote for chaos. It's not a vote for no deal. It's a vote for a better deal. It's a vote in Britain's interest. And we can go back to Brussels and we can ask for what we need. We can ask for the backstop to be replaced with a front stop, which is based on the customs procedures that are in practice all around the world. We can make the other changes, alterations to the withdrawal agreement to ensure that we have the freedom to implement a free trade agreement with the EU. And we can put text on the table. We can really give them a very strong sense of what we want. Rather than speaking in platitudes and speeches, we can actually give them what that free trade agreement would look like. We can give them the answer to the backstop, and we can have a proper discussion. And John alluded to something earlier, which is actually this was the offer that Tusk made sort of 6-8 months ago now, and it was the offer that Barnier reiterated fairly recently. So actually we're a lot closer to the EU than some people think. And so I think a deal could be done, and a good deal could be done by the end of March. And that would, ensure that we retain, crucially, our independent trade and regulatory policy, which we so need to create the Britain that each of us so badly wants.
John, I mean, how can, going ahead, Labour, what's Labour's vision? What should it be for trade between the United Kingdom, the EU and the rest of the world after all this is over?
Well, I mean, I think if we get to a stage in Parliament where all these various alternatives get voted down, which seems to be quite possible, and we do move towards a no deal, what's Brexit, then actually this is effectively providing the foundation for exactly the sort of arrangement we've just been talking about. If you get to that stage and the EU is prepared to do a free trade deal with us, and everything else has fallen, the obvious thing to do is to go ahead and build on that, get the free trade deal in place, avoid having tariffs on goods going to and from Europe, which gives them pretty well frictionless access to the European market, which is so important to people, but also rids us of all the problems about endless negotiations over transitional arrangements and all this sort of thing. It deals very substantially with the financial elements involved in paying huge sums of money with no certainty about what we're going to get at the end of the day. I mean, there will be some tough negotiations, and I must say I agree with Jennifer, we need to be pretty robust in these negotiations. It does seem to me this provides the foundation for a much better way ahead than we're in danger of embracing if we go down the withdrawal bill arrangement.
I completely agree. I think it's an absolute false choice to say it's this withdrawal agreement, no Brexit or no deal. Don't believe it when they say that. It's what they're saying now. It's what the government and the EU are saying because they want the withdrawal agreement to go through. But it doesn't have to be that way. We can have something better.
Well, thank you to both Jennifer and John for their contributions this morning. We hope you've enjoyed this discussion, and we look forward to speaking to you soon next time on agricultural policy.